Today we talk about the magic of frequency separation. Ooh. Okay, that was just plain weird. Anyway, hi, I'm Stefan Wollinger. I hope you're still doing well. Today is day 3 in a row that we talk about Photoshop actions and automation. Today we go one step further. We talk about frequency separation and retouching. Now, creating frequency separation, it takes several steps and it's, a little bit difficult to remember sometimes. So it's much easier to create an action for it so Photoshop can prepare everything nicely for us. And I'll show you how it's done. Let's jump in. As we kind of established the last 2 days, we started our episodes with looking at beautiful eyes. So why should we change a working system? So this is the gorgeous Emily. Beautiful, isn't it? All right. Now, before we start with the frequency separation, let me explain a few things up front. Number one, during frequency separation, we will apply a little bit of maths. And that maths is different if an image is 16-bit or 8-bit. Now, you can create 2 different actions that deal with either an 8-bit or a 16-bit image. However, I believe it's always best to work in 16-bit, especially when we work with fine nuances in colors. So I always use frequency separation in 16-bit. This means that one of the first steps in our action will be to convert an image from 8-bit to 16-bit in case it is 8-bit. If it is already 16-bit, this will just be ignored. Now, the other thing is, during the calculation, we will use some weird figures. Now, I don't know about you, but I personally don't like it when I don't quite understand what I'm doing. So it's easier for me to explain it up front. So when we get to it, you understand what those figures mean. And I'm talking about the number 128. So what is that number? If we jump into our colors, you see that we have 255 levels for each of our color channels. Really, we have 256 because 0 is a state as well. So 0 plus 255 is 256. Divide that by 2 and you get the number 128. So if we go to our HSB sliders and we would pick 50% gray, let's go back to our RGB sliders and you will see this is the number we're talking about. Keep that in mind when we get to it, and it will all hopefully make sense. In the action panel, you can see what we've done over the last couple of days. We created our dodge and burn layers, white teethen, watermark, and then our check white and check black actions. I've also, in preparation, created those little spaces. Again, that's something that I explained yesterday in detail. Now, before we start recording, we have to have a quick look. This image is currently a 16-bit image. For the action to work, just as a preparation, turn this into an 8-bit image so that when we run the action on an 8-bit image, it will then turn it into a 16-bit image. So we go to mode, 8-bit. That's just something I do only for this recording. Normally, I would not down convert it and then up convert it again and lose information, of course. Now, the other thing I've discussed in length over the last 2 days is that we should always create actions assuming that there are several layers already in play. To simulate this, I'll just create a few layers here, maybe even select a few and throw them into a group, just to have something that simulates an existing processing step. So let's just pick any layer, and that's a very good start for our action. That's the moment when we go into our actions panel, switch it to the button mode, go to the very end, and create our new action. We call this frequency separation and give it some color and hit record. As mentioned, the first step is to convert this to 16-bit. So we go to image, mode, 16-bit. If that image has already been 16-bit, this step will just be ignored, no problem. As our second step after converting to 16-bit, we have to create a new composite layer that takes into consideration all the layers beneath or whatever retouches may have been applied to this image already. So to do this, we create a new layer wherever we are currently inside of this group. And of course, as always, we give it a meaningful name. And before we do anything else, we have to make sure that this is now jumping to the front. We want this at the very, very top. I've explained this again yesterday. So we go to Layer, Arrange, Bring to Front, which will jump it to the top of our group. And we do this yet again, Arrange, Bring to Front, and it will jump out of the group to the very top. That's where we want it. And with these two steps, we're guaranteed that even if we start our action in the middle of a layer stack, we will have the correct position to continue. Now we use this crazy keyboard shortcut that I mentioned yesterday as well. To create this composite, we hold Command, Option, Shift, and E, at least on the Mac. And here are the equivalents for PC as well. Now that we have this, we duplicate this twice, once and twice. We rename these. The first one will be our color layer, and the second one will be our texture layer. Now that we have these, we hold the Shift key, select all of these, keep the Shift key pressed, and click on this little group icon. And as always, we give this group a meaningful name as well. As a next step, we hide the texture layer for a second, select our color layer, and we go into Filters, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and we move this slider until we see the skin texture disappear. Now that is heavily depending on the size or the resolution of the file. Best to zoom in and to judge it that way. So we have a text sharp image and we slide it up until we see that skin texture disappear. Somewhere in this case between 7 and 8. And we hit OK. That's a good moment to stop our recording. Reason being is every single image is different. So with some images, you need a little bit more of this blur. With some images, you need a little bit less. So it would be very helpful if during the run of the action, we would be able to change that blur before the rest of the action continues. So in our Actions panel, we have to click this little box here. And whenever we have this little box selected, it means that the action will run to this point and then wait for our input. So we can change the strength of our Gaussian blur and then the action will continue. So now that we have this little box ticked, we can continue. Beautiful. So now we go to our texture layer and we go to Image, Apply Image. And depending on what settings you have, it may look a little bit crazy. So here are the settings that you need. First of all, in the layer, you have to select our color layer. Yet again, a reminder why it's important to always name those layers correctly, because otherwise you wouldn't know what to pick. The second thing is you have to switch the blending mode to subtract. Now here come those crazy numbers that I explained at the beginning. There's the scale of 2 and the offset is 128, middle gray. If this would be 0, you would expect the image to go black. And if you go to 255, it will turn white. So we want to have it middle gray, 128. So now you know what that number means. The scale is a multiplier, well, or a division, depending if you use add or subtract. So 2 is softer, 1 would be too strong, and it really just goes between 1 and 2. So we'll leave it at 2. Leave everything else like it is here, so don't click on invert, leave it at 100%. But important is, at least for me, to know what those figures are actually doing. Call me a geek if you like, but I like to know what's going on. So we hit OK. That, of course, doesn't look the way we want, so we have to change the blending mode for this texture layer, and we set it to linear light. With these processes, the texture layer together with the color layer will look exactly the same as the underlying composite. So this is the composite. This is with those two layers. You won't see a difference, even though we have separated now our texture and our color. And if you go really close and you switch the texture off, you will see what a blurry mess the color layer actually is. But together, wonderful. Now, theoretically, we could stop the action right there. However, I personally don't like to work on this texture or on this color layer. I would like to have an additional backup just in case I mess something up. So I will create a duplicate of this color layer, and I'll call this edit. And I will also create a duplicate of the texture layer, and I will call this edit as well. But now when you look closely, you see that the effect is way too strong. That's because we have two layers which apply the linear light. So we have to change the blending mode of our edit layer to normal. We get our gray picture back, and then we have to clip it to our texture layer, which means that we move the mouse in between those two layers, hold the Option key, and as you move up, you can see that the cursor changes. So once the cursor changes, you click, and this will now be clipped. So now we can change things on the color layer. And if we don't like it, well, we can always create a layer mask as example, and the same applies to the texture layer as well. So this is the moment when we can stop our action. Let's try it out. We'll throw it away, zoom out a little bit, and we run our action. Voila! Right where we ticked this little box, the Gaussian blur will ask us how much we want to blur it. I still like my 7.4, but if this would be a different image, well, we would change it accordingly, and the rest of the steps are done. Wonderful. So now we can actually apply the effect to our image. Well, there's several ways how you can do this. I'll just show you the quick and dirty ones. Number one, you take the lasso tool, make sure that you add a feather. If you mark a certain area and you don't feather it up here, then you will get a very harsh line, or sometimes you see where exactly you retouched. With the feather, well, you have that little bit of a transition, be it just 5 pixels, so that it's not visible where you've made your changes. So I've created this little selection here. To be sure that I see exactly what's going on, I now hide this selection even though it's still active by pressing Command H. And I will now go into Blur, Gaussian Blur, and I blur this a little bit. I'm not going too far. If I go too far, you see how terrible that looks. If you go too low, well, you don't see a difference. I'll just go until I see a slight difference, just about here. So if I switch the preview off, it's just a very subtle change. And I hit OK. Now that I'm not obstructed by any windows or any dialog boxes, I hit Command and F, as in rerun the same filter 2 or 3 times until I think the blur is strong enough. That's why I only apply a little bit of the filter to start with, and then completely unobstructed, I just look at the skin tone and I hit the Command F several times, and for me that is already enough. So I'll do the same thing in this area here. Command H to hide it, hit the Command F a few times to blur this area. I might do this as well in this area here, hide it 3 or 4 times, maybe in this area here, hide it 3 or 4 times, then maybe in the chin area here. And all I care about is just to create even skin tones. Since I am working on the color layer, I do not change the structure or the texture at all. This is, at least for me as a people photographer, super important. I don't want to create Barbie doll plastic fantastic. I want to make sure that the skin is still intact. But at the same time, I like a very smooth color. So I'll do the same here. And when I do those selections, always try to avoid having strong contrast in the same selection. So I would never go too close to those eyebrows because that will, of course, blur into my selection. The same with different colors. So again, we do it in the forehead here. I'll hit Command H to hide it and hit Command F a few times, and doesn't look like we've done much. So let's switch this layer off and just have a look at the before and after. This is before and this is after. Before and after. Doesn't feel like we've done much, but man, it's a huge difference. Now, if you retouch people, make sure that you don't just do this to the face, but do this to the rest of the body as well. I'll do this as example here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Wonderful. Maybe we do it here. And you can go as crazy as you want. All right. So this is the before and this is the after. Massive difference with hardly any effort. And most of all, we kept all our details. Wonderful. So let's look at the second or another possibility how to use this technique. I throw this whole folder away and start again, click anywhere, run my action. Well, still the same blur. And instead of using the lasso tool, I will go into my brushes and I use the mixer brush. So zooming in a little bit. The important part here is to be very careful in what direction you are using this mixer brush. For settings, I'm using 20, 30, 100, 30. These are just values that over time I sort of figured out for myself. You can play with these or you just take these as I use them, and then you can go in and mix those colors. Be very careful. This is a very strong effect and it really depends on where you start with this brush. So if you start in the darker areas and you go into the lighter areas, well, you're moving some of the darker tones into the lighter areas. You have to be careful with this. Nevertheless, it is a very, very effective and quick way to retouch. Now, as always, I would recommend to go between the before and after quite often, because while you're zoomed in and you do these techniques, you sometimes lose a little bit the overview and the tendency to go completely overboard is quite high. I believe I probably already went a little bit too far, but nevertheless, for demonstration purposes, you see what we're doing. So going back to the original, this is before and this is after. Before and after. And as I said, I believe this is already too much, but the beautiful thing is we can, of course, always take the opacity down and fade this in just as much as we want. Now, what about the texture layer? Well, if we go to the texture layer, we can, of course, address the texture side of things. So if you take the clone stamp tool as example, we could take care of those little stray eyebrow hair. Now here's a little gotcha. Generally speaking, we use the clone stamp tool and the healing brush to apply and look at the current layer and the layers below. So the setting up here generally is at current and below. If you would use it in this way, you would get a really strange result that will look something like this. Oh well, let's undo this and we change this to only apply it to the current layer. If we do this, this will work just fine. So now we can go in and remove this. Now you will see that it removes the texture just perfectly. We sample somewhere close by and then clone it in here. That's great. Now, in this case, there's a little bit of a gray tone. I don't know if that comes through underneath here because these were darker hairs. And that, of course, is also visible in our color layer. So in our color layer, we would now have to go in and correct this slightly as well. So it is sometimes a little bit of a ping pong game. Nevertheless, if you come from here to here, this is pretty believable. And that's really it. So there's one more thing you can do. How about you just duplicate this layer here and set this layer to soft light. And now you can use that extra copy of this texture layer to further sharpen your image. So let's have a close look. This is without, this is with. If you just look at the eyebrows, this is without and this is with. Now in many cases, this is going overboard, so you can of course take the opacity down, or if it's not strong enough, you can always switch it to hard light and that effect will be even stronger. So this is before and this is after. That's now of course completely over the top, but nevertheless it works. So you can always then use that texture layer as an additional sharpening layer. In this case, you would then hold the Option key, click on the layer mask icon, make sure that the foreground color is white. Always the easiest way is just to press the letter D. For default, we'll jump white to the foreground and black to the background. Pick a brush so that we can paint on the layer mask, and we go in and paint in those eyelashes, maybe a little bit in the eyebrows, a little bit in the lips maybe. There you go. And now they are piercingly sharp. Before and after, you can see how much additional sharpness this creates. Now again, I like it natural, so I'll take this down and fade this in to maybe 30%. That gives me enough of that oomph. And we are pretty much done. Well, there you go. 3 days in a row, Photoshop automation. I hope that was a little bit helpful and gave you some ideas of how you can speed up the process in Photoshop. I don't know about you, but as much as I love tinkering around, color grading and retouching and all of that, there's one thing that I like even more, and that's being out there and taking photos. So everything that I can shorten and everything that I can let Photoshop do for me, that's a big plus. And in the free time, you know, you can do other things like drink or kiss the neighbor's wife. No, I did not. No, don't. See you next week.